The day my mother died, the world did not stop, the sun did not fall from the sky, the streets were still full of noise, people still rushed to work, children still laughed somewhere in the distance, and yet inside me, everything had collapsed in a way I did not yet understand. Before we continue with the story, kindly support the channel by hitting the like button, sharing this video, subscribing, and commenting where you're watching from. I stood beside her hospital bed watching the machine flatten into a single cold line, and even before the nurse slowly shook her head, I already knew she was gone. My legs felt hollow, like they no longer belonged to me, and when I tried to speak, no sound came out. My mother had been my anchor, my only true family, the one person who believed in me when the world treated me like nothing, and with her last breath, I felt as if she had carried my strength away with her. The funeral came too quickly, like a cruel reminder that grief does not wait for permission. The sky was gray that day, heavy with clouds that never released rain, as if even the heavens were holding their breath in sorrow. I watched the coffin being lowered into the ground and felt something tear inside my chest so violently that I thought my heart might stop right there. Around me were voices offering shallow comfort, hands patting my back, eyes that pretended to understand pain they had never tasted. My wife stood beside me, dressed in black, her face calm, too calm, and when I reached for her hand, she barely held mine before pulling away. At the time, I thought grief had made her distant, but I would later understand that her heart had already left long before my mother's body touched the earth. That night, after the guests had gone and silence settled into the walls of the house like an unwanted guest, I sat alone in the dark living room, staring at the blank television without seeing it. My phone vibrated on the table beside me, its soft buzzing sounding unbearably loud in the quiet. I picked it up without urgency, expecting maybe a message from a relative checking on me, or one of my mother's friends sending condolences. Instead, what I saw was a single sentence from my wife that felt like a knife slipping silently between my ribs. She said she couldn't continue in the marriage anymore, that she felt trapped, that she needed happiness, and that she would be moving out the next morning. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of the woman we had just buried. I read the message over and over, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something kinder, but they never did. The following morning, she moved through the house as if she were a stranger packing belongings from a place she had never loved. I watched her fold clothes, gather her jewelry, unplug appliances she had brought into the marriage, and not once did she meet my eyes with anything that resembled regret. I wanted to ask her why, wanted to scream, wanted to collapse at her feet and beg her to stay because I did not know how to survive another loss so soon. But something inside me was already too tired to fight, too numb to even feel anger, and so I said nothing as she closed the door behind her and took the last piece of my former life with her. Days turned into weeks, and grief wrapped around me like a heavy blanket I could not escape from. I barely ate, barely slept, and barely spoke to anyone. The house felt enormous without my mother's presence, without my wife's footsteps in the hallway, and every sound echoed like a reminder of what I had lost. Then, as if the betrayal itself was not enough, the truth came to me through whispers before it reached me directly. People I barely knew began to look at me with pity in their eyes, their words stumbling as they spoke, until finally one person had the courage to tell me what everyone else already knew. My wife had not just left me, she had moved in with my best friend. His name echoed in my head like a cruel joke, the same man who had stood beside me on my wedding day, who had shared drinks with me late into the night, who had sworn loyalty like a brother. I saw the pictures not long after, confirmation that the rumors were real, images of them smiling together, arms wrapped around each other, wearing happiness as if it were brand new. My chest felt like it was being crushed slowly by an invisible weight, and for the first time since my mother's death, anger broke through my numbness. It was not explosive anger that made you shout, it was the quiet kind that sits in your gut and burns slowly, day after day, changing you without mercy. The divorce process moved faster than I could comprehend. Papers arrived, signatures were demanded, terms were laid out as if I were merely dissolving a business partnership instead of the last remaining piece of my former life. I did not fight for the house, for the furniture, or for anything else. At that time, I believed I had already lost everything worth fighting for. The man who had once dreamed of building a family now signed away the shell of a dream with shaking hands. When the final document was completed, when the last legal thread tying my name to hers was cut cleanly, I did not cry. I sat completely still, staring at nothing, feeling the emptiness stretch wider and wider inside me. In the lonely months that followed, I lived as if I were invisible to the world. Friends stopped calling, partly because they did not know what to say, and partly because my wife and former best friend had quietly rewritten the narrative, turning me into the villain of a story I had never participated in. They said I was weak, that I was unstable, that I had failed as a husband, and people believed them because lies travel faster than truth when they are carried by confident voices. I let it happen because I no longer had the strength to defend myself. My mother was gone, my marriage was gone, my best friend was gone, and all that remained was a man who no longer recognized his reflection in the mirror. What I did not know then, what none of them knew at all, was that my mother had left behind more than memories. I had been raised believing we were poor, believing that survival itself was the greatest victory life could offer. I had watched her work herself to exhaustion, watched her save every coin, watched her give everything she had to ensure that I had a chance at a future. I never once imagined that beneath her quiet struggle existed a secret large enough to shake the foundations of every life connected to mine. While I mourned her as a simple woman who had lived and died unnoticed by the world, she had already begun to rewrite my destiny from beyond the grave. And so I sat there, broken and discarded, believing I had reached the very bottom, unaware that I was standing at the edge of a turning point so powerful that it would eventually force everyone who had betrayed me to confront the consequences of their choices. At that moment, I truly believed my story had ended, that pain had won, and that nothing meaningful could ever grow from the ruins of what I had lost. I could not have been more wrong. The days after the divorce papers were signed felt unreal, like I was moving through someone else's life while my own had quietly slipped away in the background. Every morning I woke up in a bed that felt too wide for one person, staring at a ceiling that no longer felt like it belonged to me, listening to the silence where my wife's voice used to exist. I kept expecting to hear my mother moving around the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast, or my wife calling my name from the hallway, annoyed about something small and ordinary. But the house answered me only with echoes, and with each passing day, the emptiness grew heavier, settling into my bones like a sickness I could not shake. I tried to distract myself with work, but even that fell apart quickly. My mind wandered constantly, replaying every memory of my marriage, searching for the exact moment when everything began to rot without my noticing. I remembered the late nights when she claimed she was tired but still stayed glued to her phone, smiling at messages she never shared with me. I remembered all the times my best friend suddenly became too busy to hang out, canceling plans he once never missed. At the time, I blamed life, stress, and adulthood for the distance growing between us, never suspecting that the two people I trusted most were slowly building a world that did not include me. The first time I saw them together in public shattered whatever fragile illusions I had left. I had gone out late one evening to buy groceries, hoping to avoid unnecessary human interaction, but fate had other plans. Across the street, illuminated by the warm glow of a restaurant's lights, I saw my wife laughing in a way she hadn't laughed with me in months. She leaned into him naturally, comfortably, as if he had always been the man meant to hold her. My best friend wrapped his arm around her waist without hesitation, without guilt, and in that moment, something inside me finally broke completely. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, unnoticed by them, watching the life I once called mine being lived by someone else as if I had never existed. Not long after that, the social media posts started. Pictures of expensive dinners, weekend trips, matching outfits, and captioned smiles that screamed victory. It was as if they wanted the world to know that they had traded me in for something better. My former best friend wrote posts about real love and choosing happiness, while my ex-wife shared images of sunsets and candles, pretending she had escaped from a prison instead of abandoning a man she once vowed to stand beside for life. Every post felt like another slap, another public confirmation that my pain was their entertainment, and I learned quickly that the internet can be a cruel place when it becomes a stage for someone else's happiness built on your ruin. People began to treat me differently after that. Some avoided me entirely, unsure of how to act around someone whose life had collapsed so publicly. Others approached me with forced sympathy, eyes filled with curiosity rather than compassion, as if my heartbreak were a story they wanted to hear for entertainment. A few quietly took sides without ever asking for my version of events, believing the confident narrative told by two smiling traitors instead of the silent wreck they left behind. I withdrew deeper into myself, realizing that when rumors grow louder than truth, silence becomes your only shield, even when it cuts just as deeply. Nights were the worst. Sleep refused to come easily, and when it did, it brought dreams that felt too real to escape. I would see my mother alive again, standing in the doorway of my childhood home, smiling at me like everything was still okay. I would reach out to her, only to wake up with my hands gripping empty air and tears soaking into the pillow. Other nights, I dreamed of my wife, standing beside me like she used to, promising that she wasn't leaving, that it was all a misunderstanding. Those dreams always ended the same way, with my best friend stepping into the frame and placing his hand on her shoulder as she turned away from me without a backward glance. My finances began to collapse around this time as well, adding another weight to the mountain already crushing me. The divorce had stripped me of more than I anticipated, and between legal fees, household debts, and the emotional neglect that had kept me from working properly for months, I found myself barely holding on. The life I once struggled to build with hope now felt like it was dissolving between my fingers. There were moments when I genuinely wondered if this was how men disappeared from the world, not through dramatic endings, but through quiet erosion, one loss at a time, until nothing recognizable remained. It was during one of those heavy, suffocating weeks that I received the phone call that would change everything, though at the time, I did not realize its true importance. The number was unfamiliar, and I considered letting it go to voicemail, assuming it was another creditor or some unwanted call from the outside world I no longer wished to engage with. But something made me answer anyway, and a calm, professional voice introduced itself as a representative from a law firm I had never heard of. At first, I thought it was a mistake, until they mentioned my mother's name, and my chest tightened so suddenly I struggled to breathe. They told me my mother had left instructions to contact me after a specific period following her death, and that the time had now arrived. My heart pounded as confusion swirled through my mind. My mother had always been transparent about everything in her life, or at least that's what I believed, and the idea that she had arranged something through a law firm without my knowledge felt strange, almost unsettling. Part of me feared it might involve debt, some hidden burden she had carried in silence and left behind for me to resolve. Still, I agreed to meet them, because hearing my mother's name spoken in any context still anchored me to life in a way nothing else could. The day I walked into that law office, I felt small and out of place, surrounded by polished floors, quiet voices, and walls decorated with certificates that spoke of wealth and authority far beyond anything I was familiar with. As I sat in the waiting area, surrounded by people who looked powerful and composed, I wondered why my struggling, grieving existence belonged in the same space as theirs. When they finally called my name, I followed the assistant down a long hallway, my heart beating so loudly in my chest that I was sure everyone could hear it. The attorney who greeted me was an older man with calm eyes and a steady voice, and as he invited me to sit, he studied my face with what felt like sympathy mixed with something else I could not quite place. He began by offering condolences for my loss, speaking my mother's name with a respect that felt deeply personal despite the professional setting. Then he mentioned documents, trusts, holdings, and agreements my mother had apparently arranged years earlier, long before her illness, long before my marriage, and long before I ever imagined she carried any remarkable secret. I listened in silence as he explained that my mother had been involved in business matters I had never known about, that she had structured her affairs carefully to protect both her identity and her assets. At first, the words sounded like they belonged to another man's life, not mine, and I kept waiting for him to clarify that this was all some misunderstanding. But the more he spoke, the more the weight of his words pressed down on me, and I realized with growing disbelief that this conversation was not about imagining a different reality. It was about revealing the one that had been hidden from me my entire life. When he finally slid the documents across the desk and told me the estimated value of what my mother had left behind, I felt my throat go dry. The number didn't feel real. It sounded like something pulled from a movie or a dream, not something that could suddenly belong to a man who had been calculating grocery money only days before. My hands shook as I stared at the papers, unable to fully process what was happening, and for a moment, I wondered if shock could physically stop a heart, because mine felt dangerously close to doing so. As I left the law firm that day, the city looked different to me, as if some invisible filter had been lifted from my eyes. Cars moved the same, people walked the same, and the world continued exactly as it always had, yet everything inside me had shifted. The man who entered that building expecting only explanations had walked out carrying the weight of a truth that rewrote his entire existence. I still felt broken from grief and betrayal, but beneath that pain, something unfamiliar had begun to grow, something quiet and powerful that I could not yet name. At that moment, I did not rush to celebrate, I did not call anyone, and I did not even smile. I simply walked forward, knowing without fully understanding why that my life had just crossed into a new chapter one was not prepared for, but which would soon prepare me in ways I never imagined. For days after leaving that law office, I said nothing to anyone about what I had learned, not even to the few people who still checked on me out of habit rather than loyalty. The truth felt too large, too dangerous to speak aloud, as though saying it might cause it to vanish like a dream spoken too soon after waking. I returned to my small, half-empty apartment each night and sat in the dark, replaying the lawyer's words in my head, trying to accept that my mother, the woman who once borrowed money from neighbors to pay school fees, had secretly built something vast and powerful without my knowledge. The contrast between who I thought she was and what she truly was left me feeling both awestruck and ashamed for never seeing the signs. I began to reflect deeply on my childhood, revisiting old memories with new eyes, searching for clues that might explain the invisible world she had lived in parallel to our struggling life. I remembered strange phone calls she used to take late at night, stepping outside to speak in hushed voices, always telling me it was nothing important. I remembered the business trips she claimed were cleaning jobs in other towns, the envelopes she hid in locked drawers, the foreign magazines she sometimes flipped through absent-mindedly before quickly putting them away when she noticed me watching. At the time, I saw only a hard-working woman trying to survive. Now I realized she had been protecting something far greater than survival, she had been protecting me. The law firm contacted me again days later to begin the formal transition process, and each new meeting peeled away another layer of the mystery surrounding my mother's hidden legacy. I learned that she had been an early investor in a technology startup that grew into a multinational empire, and that she had continued to reinvest quietly through shell corporations under agreements that guaranteed my future inheritance without exposing her identity. She had lived modestly by choice, refused to draw attention to herself, and ensured that no one ever connected her name to the wealth she helped create. As I listened, I felt both pride and sorrow rising within me, pride for the brilliance she had hidden so well, and sorrow for the sacrifices she had made without ever letting me share the burden or the reward with her. The reality of the money itself did not feel real to me at first. Papers and numbers still felt like ideas rather than tangible changes to my life. I didn't suddenly feel rich, powerful, or confident. I still slept on a worn mattress, still ate instant noodles some nights, still walked through the same streets where people pitted me for being the man whose wife left him for his best friend. What changed was not my environment but the awareness now sitting quietly in my chest like an ember waiting for oxygen. I understood that my position in the world had shifted even if nothing around me yet reflected that shift, and that understanding carried both opportunity and danger in equal measure. As the legal team worked through the logistics, they advised me to keep everything confidential for the time being, explaining that sudden wealth had a way of attracting the wrong kind of attention. Their words aligned with the instinct already growing within me to remain unseen, especially by the two people who had so recently celebrated my destruction. I imagined the look on my ex-wife's face if she knew what sat silently behind my eyes, and for the first time since her betrayal, the image did not break me. Instead, it stirred something colder, steadier, something that resembled control. I began to see my recent suffering in a new light, not as a permanent end but as the furnace that stripped away my dependence on others. Losing my wife forced me to confront how much of my identity I had wrapped around someone who was never truly mine. Losing my best friend forced me to accept how fragile loyalty can be when temptation arrives in comfort and secrecy. Losing my mother shattered the illusion that life is fair, yet her hidden gift proved that even in tragedy, purpose can be quietly planted beneath the surface of ruin. I was no longer just surviving loss, I was being reshaped by it. With nothing left to dissolve my focus, I poured myself into learning. The legal team introduced me to financial advisors who spoke the language of markets and leverage with a fluency that initially overwhelmed me. I spent long nights reading reports, studying investment principles, and understanding how wealth actually moves through the world rather than how it is portrayed in stories. The more I learned, the more I realized how blind I had been before, how the world operates on invisible systems that reward those who understand them and devour those who do not. Knowledge became my refuge, my therapy, and my weapon all at once. While I was building quietly, my ex-wife and former best friend were building loudly. Their life together grew more extravagant by the week, at least on the surface. New cars appeared in their posts, exotic vacations replaced local outings, and their captions dripped with triumph and careless joy. It was clear that they believed the world now belonged to them, that they had escaped mediocrity by abandoning me. What they did not know was that some of their sudden fortune came indirectly from assets that still bore my name in quiet legal structures, assets they believed they had already stripped from my life during the divorce. The irony of that truth sat heavy in my chest, waiting patiently for the right moment. At times, anger would still surge through me without warning, especially on nights when loneliness pressed hardest against my ribs. I would replay the betrayal in vivid detail, reliving the lies, the stolen glances, the cold indifference that replaced the love I once trusted. But unlike before, that anger no longer left me feeling powerless. It sharpened me. It reminded me that I had survived what should have destroyed me, and that survival carries a responsibility to become more than the version of yourself that others tried to erase. Slowly, almost without noticing, my posture changed. The way I walked through crowded rooms changed. The fear that once bent my shoulders inward began to loosen its grip. I was still wounded, still carrying the weight of the dead and the departed within me, but I was no longer only a victim of circumstance. I was becoming a participant in my own destiny again. The man who once signed divorce papers in numb surrender was being quietly replaced by a man who studied contracts with deliberate patience. One afternoon, as I left another strategy meeting with the financial advisors, I caught my reflection in the glass wall of a building and barely recognized the person staring back. My eyes still carried sadness, but beneath it was something steadier than despair. I realized that wealth alone had not changed me yet, but the responsibility of it was already altering how I thought, how I planned, and how I measured my future. I was no longer searching for rescue, I was learning how to build. At night, when silence returned and the world darkened, I still spoke to my mother in my thoughts. I told her about the things I was learning, the obstacles I feared, and the strength I was slowly discovering within myself. I asked her why she had hidden so much from me, and though she never answered, I felt somehow that her reasons were rooted in protection rather than distance. She had wanted me to grow without leaning on invisible power, to understand struggle before inheriting abundance. And now that I had tasted loss in every form she feared for me, she had finally opened the door she had guarded so fiercely in life. As the days passed, one certainty settled deeper into my bones with every step forward I took in the shadows. I would not waste what my mother left behind. I would not announce myself recklessly or seek validation from the same world that turned away when I was broken. I would move quietly, deliberately, and strategically, shaping a future so solid that no betrayal could ever shake it again. I did not yet know exactly how or when my path would cross with the ones who hurt me most, but I knew with unsettling clarity that when it did, I would not be the same man they once abandoned without fear. For months I remained hidden in plain sight, a ghost in the world I once inhabited openly. I rented offices under assumed names, opened accounts through trusted intermediaries, and acquired assets in ways designed to ensure no one could trace my movements too quickly. Each day I woke with the same thought repeating in my mind: I will never allow myself to be powerless again. I immersed myself completely in business, finance, and strategy, filling every hour with knowledge that sharpened me more than grief ever could. I read reports that once seemed like gibberish, now studying them as though each graph, each table, each line of data were instructions written just for me. Slowly, the pieces of power began to align, unseen but unstoppable, and I realized that my former life had merely been the preparation I never understood I was undergoing. The irony was delicious. My ex-wife and my former best friend paraded their success, flaunted what they believed they had won, but all of it was built on illusions. They were confident, loud, and careless, assuming that the man they had left behind was still powerless, broken, and forgotten. But the truth was that I had been building while they were busy celebrating my absence. While they posted glamorous photos and sipped champagne in front of cameras, I had learned the real value of influence, money, and leverage. I had discovered that true power isn't flaunted, it is cultivated quietly, invisibly, and it cannot be stolen by anyone except through your own negligence. That realization settled in me like armor, and for the first time in years, I felt the warmth of control spread slowly through my chest. There were nights when temptation almost lured me to announce my fortune, to post a single image, a single word that would make them feel even a fraction of what I had endured. I resisted because I had begun to understand the beauty of timing, the artistry of patience. True power does not scream, it waits. And my moment, I knew, would be devastatingly perfect when it finally arrived. Every call, every meeting, every calculated investment was a brick in the fortress I was building around my future. Each decision I made carried the weight of years of betrayal and loss, and for the first time, I realized that vengeance was not just emotional, it was strategic, and strategy had a beauty all its own. I hired experts who whispered the language of the wealthy and influential, advisors who never asked for friendship but only for results. They taught me how to shield assets, how to anticipate market movements, and how to invest in ventures that multiplied quietly, invisibly, while the world remained distracted by gossip and spectacle. I became fluent in the language of wealth and influence in ways that my mother had hinted at but never fully explained. Her lessons, delivered silently throughout my life, became a roadmap for domination. I understood at last that the true inheritance she had left me was not money alone, but the ability to survive betrayal and transform it into power. Evenings remained the hardest. I would occasionally find myself alone in my apartment, staring at my reflection in the darkened glass of the window, and thinking of them, my wife and my best friend. I did not fantasize about revenge in the childish sense of wanting them to suffer, rather, I envisioned the perfect unveiling of the truth, the moment where all their arrogance and carelessness would meet the consequences of underestimating me. My grief had transformed into something colder, sharper, more precise than anger. It was a quiet, persistent fire that reminded me daily that I would never again be the man they thought they had broken. I was becoming something new, something they could never predict. The first major step in my plan came when I decided to expand my investments internationally, moving funds and acquiring stakes in companies that could operate under my name without attracting attention. Every day, I learned something new: how to negotiate contracts, how to maneuver through bureaucracies, how to quietly outthink competitors who considered themselves untouchable. Each success, though invisible to the world, felt like a personal victory. I could feel myself growing stronger, my confidence solidifying, my mind becoming sharper than it had ever been in my youth. I began to walk taller, to speak more deliberately, and to view every person, every interaction, as a potential chess piece in a game only I understood. During this time, I also began to study human nature with a new intensity. Betrayal, I realized, often comes from weakness disguised as strength. People who hurt others with such certainty often do so because they assume those they abandon cannot fight back. They underestimate pain's transformative power, forgetting that suffering can teach resilience, patience, and cunning in ways comfort never could. I studied their patterns, their habits, their routines, and I realized that every moment I had spent grieving had also been a moment of preparation. They had thought me defeated, but in truth, I was evolving in the quiet shadows, and when I emerged, the world would notice, not because I wanted attention, but because power has a way of announcing itself in dramatic and inescapable ways. By the end of the year, my portfolio had grown far beyond what I had imagined possible when the lawyer first revealed my mother's secret. I controlled assets across continents, held stakes in companies that touched millions of lives daily, and had built a foundation so secure that the losses of the past no longer scared me. Every decision I made was deliberate, every move calculated, and every action intentional. The man who had once been betrayed, abandoned, and humiliated had now become someone even I barely recognized, someone who could not be dismissed, underestimated, or ignored. I had transformed grief into strategy, loss into learning, and betrayal into a source of unstoppable momentum. I began to imagine how the world would react when I finally revealed myself. Their smugness, their arrogance, their careless laughter at my supposed failure, all of it would meet the consequences of their ignorance. I envisioned the look on my ex-wife's face when she realized that the man she thought powerless now controlled the very world she had tried to enter through betrayal. I imagined my former best friend's shock, the disbelief that someone he had mocked and abandoned could rise so quickly and decisively beyond his comprehension. Each scenario I played out in my mind sharpened my resolve, and I understood that patience, above all, was my greatest weapon. The final realization settled over me quietly one night as I watched the city skyline from my apartment, lit in 100,000 lights, each representing opportunities, failures, and power. I realized that the man who had once been defined by others' choices was now fully his own. I was no longer the grieving son, the abandoned husband, or the betrayed friend. I was a man shaped by every loss and betrayal, tempered by patience, armed with knowledge, and equipped with resources unimaginable to those who had once thought they owned me. I understood then that true revenge, true satisfaction, is not loud or immediate, it is strategic, inescapable, and inevitable. And so, as the city slept, I made a silent promise to myself: when the time came to step back into the light, when the world, including the two people who had once defined me, finally saw what I had become, it would be more than shock. It would be a demonstration of everything they had underestimated: intelligence, patience, and the quiet, terrifying power of a man who had learned to rise from the ashes of his own life. It was almost a year after I had begun rebuilding my life in secret when the invitation arrived, the one I had both dreaded and anticipated for months. A crisp envelope, heavy with elegance, bearing the names of the two people who had shattered my world in black ink that seemed to mock me. My ex-wife and my former best friend were getting married, and they wanted me to be present. I stared at the envelope for several long minutes, my hands trembling not from anger, but from the strange combination of curiosity and anticipation. I had already prepared myself for confrontation in my mind, rehearsing countless scenarios where I might reveal the truth about what they had done, but nothing could have fully captured the weight of seeing it in reality. I walked to my desk and opened the invitation carefully, examining every detail. The venue was lavish, the kind of place most people only see in magazines or on social media. The dates were chosen for maximum spectacle, as if they intended to prove to the world how perfect their lives were. I imagined the photographers capturing every smile, every embrace, every meaningless gesture they would believe showed triumph. I sat back, silent, considering my options. I could ignore it, vanish entirely, and let them continue in blissful ignorance of what I had become. Or I could attend, invisible at first, and then carefully orchestrate the moment that would undo everything they had taken from me. The first step was preparation, both mental and logistical. I hired discreet security experts to ensure nothing could go wrong, advisors who could help me enter and exit without interference, and strategists who advised me on timing and visibility. Everything had to be perfect, because I knew that one small mistake could ruin the effect I had been cultivating for months. I spent nights plotting the unveiling of the truth, studying the venue layouts, analyzing the social media habits of their friends and associates, and imagining how cameras might capture my entrance. Every detail mattered, because I was no longer the man who allowed things to happen to him. I was now the architect of a revelation that would reverberate far beyond that room. The day of the wedding, I dressed in simple yet impeccably tailored clothing, nothing flashy, nothing meant to draw attention immediately. I wanted them to feel comfortable, confident, and smug, because their underestimation would make the eventual impact all the more devastating. As I arrived at the venue, I remained at the periphery, watching the guests arrive and observing the interactions of my ex-wife and former best friend. Their laughter, their shared glances, the way they moved as if they had conquered the world, it all fueled a calm determination in me. The anger that had once burned like wildfire had transformed into something colder and sharper: focus. I would not yell, I would not plead, would not stumble. I would dominate silently, efficiently, inevitably. I sent a carefully crafted anonymous gift ahead of time, one that I knew would be noticed but whose origin would remain mysterious. The entire wedding had been paid for in advance, the most extravagant elements covered without their knowledge. The florist, the catering, even the live band, all perfectly arranged and prepaid. The irony was delicious. They believed they were indulging in luxury bought with their own cunning and charm, unaware that the hand that funded their celebration was mine. It was a message in itself, though subtle, a whisper that would go unheard until the time came for the main act. And in that subtlety, I found satisfaction, because there was something infinitely more powerful in controlling events from the shadows than confronting them openly. As the ceremony began, I remained seated at the back, a calm observer of the spectacle they had built from my loss. Their smiles were wide, their friends cheering, cameras flashing, and yet none of it belonged to them in reality. I studied their expressions carefully, noting the moments when arrogance shone brightest, when confidence was highest, because those would be the moments that would magnify the shock to come. They believed they had climbed to the pinnacle, that they had left me behind as a broken man with nothing but memories and bitterness. They could not have been more wrong, and the realization that they had done all of this under false pretenses filled me with a quiet, steady satisfaction I could feel in my chest. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. I rose, walked slowly, deliberately, toward the front, blending with a few late-arriving guests who had not yet noticed me. My presence went unnoticed at first, which was exactly as I intended. I could see her from a distance, my ex-wife, radiant in her gown, laughing with friends, unaware that the man she had discarded was now standing behind her. My former best friend, proud and self-assured, did not suspect that I had been watching every detail, calculating every angle, understanding every weakness. The control I now had over the narrative, the very moment they believed belonged solely to them, was intoxicating, and yet I remained composed, letting the anticipation stretch as long as possible. When I finally reached the center of the room, all eyes turned toward me, confusion rippling through the crowd like a sudden chill. Cameras captured my arrival in real time, flashes illuminating my calm expression as the whispers began to circulate. My ex-wife's face paled, and her laughter faltered as recognition hit her. My former best friend's jaw tightened, his posture stiffened, and the smug confidence he had carried for so long evaporated in an instant. I smiled softly, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement of the work I had done, the patience I had maintained, and the power I now held. Their world had shifted in a single heartbeat, and I savored that subtle but complete victory. I took the microphone with the same calm, deliberate composure I had honed during months of preparation. The room fell into stunned silence as I addressed the couple and their guests. I did not shout, I did not accuse, I did not cry. Instead, I spoke clearly, detailing the legacy my mother had left, the wealth I now controlled, and the careful orchestration that had allowed me to grow stronger while remaining invisible. The numbers, the companies, the strategic acquisitions, all laid bare. Gasps filled the room, but I continued, because this was not about spectacle, it was about unveiling a truth they had never expected, a truth that would redefine their understanding of everything they had taken for granted. The faces of my ex-wife and former best friend were unforgettable in that moment: disbelief, shock, fear, and finally, dawning horror as the realization of what they had underestimated fully sank in. Their triumphant smiles were gone, replaced by the stark awareness that the man they had believed powerless was not only alive, but more formidable than they had ever imagined. The room was silent except for my voice and the stunned breathing of those who understood, at last, that their assumptions had been fatal. And in that silence, I felt an almost divine satisfaction, not because I delighted in their suffering, but because justice, delayed but precise, had finally arrived exactly as it should. The moment I stepped onto that stage, the air itself seemed to change. The chatter, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, all of it stopped as if the room realized that reality had shifted in a way it could not comprehend. Eyes widened, whispers rippled through the crowd, and my ex-wife froze mid-smile, her laughter dying in her throat. My former best friend's confident posture faltered as he took a step back, his mind racing to understand how the man they had left behind could suddenly appear at the pinnacle of their fantasy. It was a scene I had envisioned countless times in the quiet hours of the night, but seeing it unfold in real life was far more powerful, far more intoxicating than I had anticipated. I held the microphone lightly, my voice calm but deliberate, each word chosen with care, resonating with authority that left no room for interruption. I congratulated the couple politely, acknowledging the effort they had invested into what they believed was their triumph, and then I began to reveal the truth. I spoke of the inheritance my mother had left me, the $300 million she had quietly amassed and shielded from view, the investments that had multiplied under my careful direction, and the network of companies and properties now under my control. The silence in the room grew heavier with each sentence, the gasps sharper, as the reality of my rise became undeniable. I saw it first in her eyes, disbelief, followed by a flicker of fear, then dawning comprehension. The woman who had laughed at my supposed failures now realized that every assumption she had made about me was wrong. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the arm of my former best friend, as if seeking stability from the very man whose betrayal had once shattered me. The air was thick with tension, and I allowed a brief pause to let the weight of my words settle, to let the magnitude of what they had underestimated finally register. Power, I realized, is at its most potent when others are blind to it until the moment it is undeniable. Then I delivered the coup de grace. I revealed how their own actions had been under observation, how their thefts, lies, and manipulations had been traced, documented, and prepared for exposure. The authorities, quietly summoned in advance, began to move discreetly through the room. Cameras clicked, recording not just my announcement but the unfolding consequences for those who had believed themselves untouchable. The expression on my former best friend's face shifted from shock to horror as he realized the depth of his mistakes, the reckoning he had never anticipated now inevitable. My ex-wife, caught between disbelief and panic, looked as if the ground itself had opened beneath her feet, leaving her suspended in a moment of unbearable clarity. I paused again, letting the whispers and murmurs fill the space, before continuing. I described how my mother's careful planning, combined with my own patience and strategic thinking, had ensured that justice would be served in a way they could not evade. The money they had believed they were spending, the ostentatious displays of triumph, the arrogance they carried into the room, they had all been irrelevant in the face of a power they had failed to recognize. And as their realization deepened, I felt a strange sense of closure, not in the thrill of vengeance, but in the satisfaction of the balance finally restored. The room had gone completely silent now, save for my voice and the careful footsteps of authorities approaching. My ex-wife's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. My former best friend's face had turned pale, sweat beading at his temples as he attempted to process the sudden collapse of his carefully constructed illusion. Guests, initially confused, now began to whisper among themselves, cameras capturing every detail. It was a moment that belonged not to anger, but to inevitability, the precise culmination of months of planning, patience, and unwavering focus. And as I looked over the stunned faces, I understood that nothing could ever undo what had just occurred. The authorities approached, gently but firmly, and the gravity of the situation fully dawned on the couple. Arrests were made discreetly, their fate sealed not by rash action but by meticulous preparation. I did not gloat. I did not yell. I simply observed, the calm architect of the outcome I had envisioned. The realization that I had maintained composure while orchestrating their exposure, while preserving my own dignity and power, filled me with a quiet pride unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was proof that transformation, patience, and strategic action could outlast betrayal, cruelty, and arrogance. After the officers escorted them from the venue, I remained for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of the event. Guests continued to murmur, some approaching me with questions and congratulations, but I remained calm, almost detached, feeling the weight of every decision that had led to this precise moment. I had once been the grieving, abandoned husband, the betrayed friend, the invisible man living in loss. Now, I was the one who controlled reality, the one whose patience had turned grief into power, the one who had ensured that justice, subtle and precise, had been delivered without compromise. That night, as I left the wedding hall and walked through the city streets alone, I felt the quiet weight of transformation settle fully into my being. I understood, with a clarity that no grief, betrayal, or loss had previously allowed, that I was no longer defined by the actions of others. The man they had tried to destroy had risen, and in that rise, I had discovered not just power, but freedom. Every step I took was measured, deliberate, and full of the calm assurance that comes from knowing the world had finally adjusted to the presence of someone it had underestimated for far too long. And as I looked out over the city from my apartment that night, lights twinkling like the promise of endless possibilities, I felt a quiet gratitude for the journey. I had been tested, broken, and abandoned, but in the process, I had become something greater than I had ever imagined. The people who had thought themselves victorious were gone, and the life they had tried to claim from me had been reclaimed in the most complete and satisfying way imaginable. That night, I realized that the man who had once been powerless was now not just free, but unstoppable. The weeks after that night were surreal, almost dreamlike, though I knew everything I had accomplished was very real. I moved quietly, deliberately, consolidating assets, expanding investments, and strengthening the empire my mother had left behind. The wealth was no longer just a number on paper, it was a tool, a force, a structure that allowed me to operate in ways I had never imagined before. Each decision I made was infused with the calm assurance of someone who had endured betrayal, loss, and humiliation and had emerged not just intact but transformed into something far stronger than I had ever been. I avoided ostentation, keeping my life understated publicly while maneuvering behind the scenes with precision. The world had seen the unveiling at the wedding, but most did not understand the full scope of what had happened or the depth of my strategy. Only a select few advisors and confidants knew the extent of my wealth and influence. I trusted them implicitly, for I had learned the hard way that loyalty is rare, and even those closest to you can be tempted by greed and opportunity. Every move was calculated, every relationship measured, because I had seen firsthand how quickly trust could be betrayed. During this time, I began to reflect more on my personal growth, the transformation that had occurred silently while the world believed me broken. I realized that my grief, though painful, had been a crucible that reshaped my character, teaching me patience, resilience, and clarity of purpose. I understood my mother's wisdom in shielding her wealth, for it forced me to grow into the man capable of managing it. Every lesson, every hardship, every moment of betrayal had been preparation, and I began to see the beauty in that carefully constructed process. The pain I had once wished to escape had become the foundation for a power I could wield without fear. I also recognized the importance of timing in every action I took. Patience had been my ally, teaching me that the right moment for action could amplify impact exponentially. The wedding had been the first perfect display of this principle, but it was only the beginning. I began to plan carefully for the future, ensuring that every investment, every acquisition, and every public action served both my growth and the eventual reshaping of my personal narrative. This approach was methodical, deliberate, and far removed from impulsive reactions driven by emotion. It was strategy in its purest form, honed by suffering, strengthened by loss, and guided by the lessons of my mother's wisdom. In the quieter moments, I still reflected on my ex-wife and my former best friend, not with malice but with clarity. Their arrogance, their underestimation, and their cruelty had inadvertently fueled my rise. I realized that true strength is not measured by immediate triumphs but by the ability to endure, to grow silently, and to execute plans with precision when the moment is right. Their actions, though devastating at the time, had become the very catalyst for my transformation. What they had assumed was a weakness became the foundation for an empire they could never imagine, and in understanding this, I felt an unshakable sense of vindication. The empire I was building was not just financial, it was personal. I nurtured relationships selectively, creating alliances based on trust, intelligence, and mutual respect rather than convenience or superficiality. I surrounded myself with people who valued integrity, loyalty, and strategy, the very traits my former closest companions had lacked. Each partnership was intentional, each agreement meticulously crafted, and each interaction calculated to maximize long-term stability and influence. I realized that in the absence of betrayal, one cannot truly recognize the value of discernment, and I had now become a master of reading both intentions and opportunities. I began to travel, though discreetly, visiting subsidiaries, partners, and investments that spanned multiple countries. Each journey reinforced my understanding of global markets, business dynamics, and human behavior. I observed patterns, predicted trends, and learned to act in ways that leveraged both knowledge and timing. The man who had once been abandoned and ridiculed was now commanding attention in boardrooms, negotiating deals that would have been impossible to fathom a year prior. The transformation was complete, not because of the money alone, but because I had become the person capable of wielding it effectively. During these travels, I occasionally thought of my mother, imagining her watching from wherever she might be, proud that her careful planning had not been wasted. I realized that the lessons she had imparted through subtle guidance, through her silence, and through her hidden wealth had ensured my survival and my rise. Without her foresight, I would not have had the means or the understanding to execute the plans I had cultivated. Her influence, though invisible for so long, had been the true engine behind every step I now took with confidence, every decision I made with clarity, and every outcome I achieved with precision. By the end of the year, my presence in the financial world was undeniable, though largely invisible to those outside my inner circle. I had become a force of influence, one that could shift markets, affect business decisions, and command attention without ever needing to announce myself publicly. My ex-wife and former best friend had faded from immediate relevance, but the knowledge that their past actions had propelled me to this position remained an internal satisfaction I carried privately. The man they had tried to destroy had not only survived but had become something far greater than they had ever imagined. And in the quiet moments, alone in my penthouse overlooking the city lights, I understood that the journey had changed me in ways money alone could never explain. I was no longer the grieving, powerless man from the past. I had become deliberate, patient, and strategic, capable of transforming loss into power and betrayal into opportunity. The journey was complete not in its vengeance but in its revelation, that the strength born from suffering is more profound than any fortune, and that the man I had become could never again be underestimated, manipulated, or discarded. If you're ready, I can continue with Chapter 8, the final chapter, bringing the story to its climax and resolution while keeping the same high-quality style, emotional intensity, and required word count. The weeks following the wedding reveal became a period of consolidation, reflection, and quiet triumph. While the world had witnessed a fragment of what I could do, the full scope of my power remained largely invisible, carefully shielded from those who would misuse it or attempt to undermine me. I continued to expand my influence with precision, ensuring that every move served both long-term stability and personal integrity. There was no need for public displays or validation from outsiders. The satisfaction came from knowing that my strategy was flawless and my patience had delivered results beyond imagination. The man they thought broken was now a silent force no one could ignore. Even as my empire grew, I never lost sight of the man I had been, the grief-stricken son, the abandoned husband, and the betrayed friend. Those experiences had forged the foundation for the man I had become. I remembered the countless nights of despair, the isolation, the heartbreak, and the moments of hopelessness where I had thought life was over. And yet, every single one of those moments had contributed to my evolution. Without them, I would not have understood the true value of patience, the importance of strategic thinking, or the necessity of cultivating inner strength in silence. The losses I endured had been cruel teachers, but they had also been the architects of my transformation. I often reflected on my ex-wife and former best friend, not with hatred, but with the clarity of someone who had surpassed their influence entirely. Their arrogance, the very force that had driven them to betray me, had become the fuel for my rise. I recognized that they would never understand the depths of my growth, the careful planning, and the invisible influence I now wielded. That indifference to their understanding was liberating. I no longer sought validation, revenge, or acknowledgement from those who had wronged me. Their ignorance of my true power was a testament to my patience, a proof that real strength does not require recognition, it requires strategy, persistence, and the ability to endure. I expanded my philanthropic efforts carefully, honoring my mother's legacy while ensuring that each project reflected both impact and discretion. Unlike my ex-wife, who had always sought applause for superficial gestures, I understood that influence and good intentions could coexist without spectacle. I established educational funds, invested in sustainable businesses, and supported initiatives that empowered communities far beyond the reach of social media or public praise. These actions were invisible to most, but they created lasting change in ways that vanity never could. My mother had taught me that power without purpose is hollow, and I had finally learned how to wield both responsibly. In quieter moments, I also reflected on love and trust. After the betrayal, I had feared both, but the journey had taught me that the right people, the right relationships, and the right circumstances could transform vulnerability into strength. I began cultivating friendships and partnerships built on respect and shared vision, rather than obligation or convenience. Trust became selective but genuine, and I learned to recognize the subtle cues of loyalty and integrity, refining my ability to discern true allies from opportunists. The pain of the past had not only strengthened my business acumen but had reshaped my understanding of human connections in ways that felt profound, deliberate, and life-affirming. Occasionally, memories of the wedding would surface, particularly the stunned faces of my ex-wife and former best friend. I remembered the precise moment their smug confidence shattered, replaced by panic and disbelief. Those images no longer brought anger or desire for retribution. Instead, they reminded me of the power of patience, strategy, and preparation. Their failure to anticipate my growth had cemented my understanding that life rewards those who endure quietly, who think strategically, and who act decisively when the moment is right. I realized that my satisfaction was not in their suffering, but in the knowledge that I had transformed adversity into mastery, and that mastery would endure far beyond fleeting emotions. With each passing day, I felt more anchored in the life I had built. I had wealth, influence, and the freedom to shape my destiny. Yet more importantly, I had the wisdom and resilience that no betrayal could ever take away. I no longer measured myself by what others had done to me, but by the integrity of my actions, the clarity of my decisions, and the patience I had cultivated over time. I understood that power is most profound when it is invisible until revealed at the perfect moment, and that true freedom comes not from wealth alone, but from the ability to act decisively, deliberately, and with purpose. One evening, as I stood by the window of my penthouse, gazing over the city lights, I reflected on the full arc of my journey. I remembered my mother's quiet guidance, her sacrifices, and her wisdom that had led me to this moment. I thought of the grief that had once consumed me, the betrayal that had left me raw, and the moments of doubt that had threatened to undo everything. And yet, here I was, standing in the aftermath of every challenge, transformed not by luck, but by perseverance, intelligence, and strategic action. The man who had once been powerless was now unstoppable, and that realization brought a sense of peace unlike anything I had experienced before. Finally, I understood that life's greatest victories are not those visible to the world, but those quietly built through resilience, intelligence, and unwavering focus. My mother's legacy had been the seed, my pain had been the fertilizer, and my patience had been the sunlight that allowed it to grow into something unstoppable. I had endured betrayal, loss, and heartbreak, but I had emerged not just intact, but transformed into a man capable of shaping the world on his terms. The people who had once abandoned me were no longer part of my narrative, except as distant echoes of the lessons that had brought me to this moment. I was free, powerful, and finally whole, and the story of my rise from devastation to mastery would be mine and mine alone. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if this video inspired you, and drop your location in the comments.